GMOs are one of the most polarizing topics in science today. Genetically engineered medicine, like insulin produced by modified bacteria, is widely accepted without much fuss. But the moment genetic engineering shows up on a dinner plate, the debate ignites. Why does the exact same underlying technology get treated so differently depending on where it ends up? Let's dig into the facts, the fears, and where this technology might actually be headed. Here's something that often gets lost in the debate. Humans have been genetically modifying plants and animals for thousands of years already. If a handful of your crops happened to produce an especially good yield, or one of your wolves turned out unusually loyal and easy to work with, the smart move was to breed from those individuals specifically. Traits are just the visible expression of genes, so breeding selectively for a trait, generation after generation, gradually made the underlying genes more pronounced. After thousands of years of that slow, deliberate process, almost every plant and animal we interact with today looks and behaves nothing like its wild, pre-domesticated ancestor. So if humans have been reshaping genomes for millennia already, what actually makes a modern, lab-engineered GMO fundamentally different? The honest answer is precision, not intent. Traditional selective breeding is essentially organized gambling. You breed for a trait and hope the genetics cooperate. Genetic engineering removes that guesswork almost entirely. Scientists can select a specific trait directly, bigger fruit, built-in pest resistance, whatever the goal happens to be, without needing generations of hopeful trial and error. The first genetically engineered whole food actually reached grocery shelves back in 1994, a tomato called the Flavor Saver, engineered to ripen more slowly so it could stay firm and fresh longer during shipping, instead of the usual approach of picking tomatoes green and gassing them with ethylene later to force an artificial ripening. It was a genuine technical success and a commercial disappointment. Production costs were high, and it never turned a profit before being discontinued a few years later. But it opened the door. Within just a couple of years, engineered soybeans and corn resistant to insects or herbicides were being planted across millions of acres, and adoption only accelerated from there. Given that precision, why does the technology still make so many people uneasy? Part of the answer is that GMO actually covers a wider range of techniques than most people realize, and they're not all equally controversial. The older, more familiar method, Transgenics, involves inserting a gene from one species into a completely different one, like the bacterial gene used in Bt crops. Newer tools like CRISPR gene editing work differently. Rather than adding foreign DNA, they let scientists make small, precise edits directly to an organism's own existing genes, sometimes producing changes that are difficult to distinguish from a mutation that could plausibly have occurred naturally or through conventional breeding. Regulators in a growing number of countries have started treating CRISPR-edited crops that don't contain foreign DNA differently from traditional transgenic GMOs, which has already started to reshape which techniques actually count as controversial in practice, even though public perception hasn't fully caught up with that regulatory distinction yet. Let's start with one of the most common objections to older-style genetic engineering: gene flow, the concern that genetically modified crops could cross-pollinate with traditional ones and pass along unintended new traits. There's actually a method that could all but guarantee this never happens, but it's controversial enough to be one of the biggest anti-GMO talking points in its own right: so-called terminator seeds, engineered to produce sterile plants, which would force farmers to buy fresh seed every single season instead of saving their own. The idea alone sparked enough public backlash that the technology was never actually deployed commercially, which brings the conversation right back to the original worry: unintentional gene spread. There have been real, documented cases of GM plants turning up in places they were never deliberately planted, and modified genetic material has occasionally been detected in unrelated crops nearby. That said, GM plants can't spread completely unchecked. Many crop species pollinate themselves rather than cross-pollinating with neighbors, and any two plants generally have to be closely related species to interbreed at all. On top of that, farmers use practical safeguards like buffer zones between fields specifically to minimize accidental crossing. But even granting that a GMO could, in principle, occasionally cross with a related non-GMO plant, there's a more important question underneath all of this. Is food grown from GM crops actually different from food grown the conventional way? This question has been central to the debate since day one. Before any GM crop intended for human consumption reaches a grocery shelf, it's tested extensively for potential risks, and those results get independently reviewed by multiple regulatory agencies. In the United States alone, a new GM crop typically has to satisfy 3 separate agencies before commercial approval. The USDA evaluates its impact on agriculture and other plants. The EPA reviews it if the crop produces its own pesticide, and the FDA assesses whether the resulting food is safe to eat. Similar multi-agency review processes exist across most of the world, though approval timelines and requirements vary significantly by country. After more than 30 years and thousands of individual studies, the scientific consensus on this particular question is about as settled as science gets. Eating food from GM crops carries no more risk than eating the conventional equivalent. That regulatory caution has occasionally slowed down GMOs that seem, in hindsight, almost uncontroversial. Golden rice is the clearest example, a rice variety engineered in the late 1990s to produce beta-carotene, which the body converts into vitamin A, aimed specifically at reducing vitamin A deficiency, a condition that causes blindness and contributes to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of children a year in parts of the developing world where rice is a dietary staple and vitamin-rich foods are scarce. Despite that, golden rice spent roughly 2 decades tangled in regulatory review and organized opposition campaigns before finally receiving approval for cultivation in a handful of countries in the 2020s. Whatever one thinks about the underlying safety debate, that specific multi-decade delay is now widely cited, including by some scientists who were originally cautious about GM crops in general, as a case where excess caution plausibly cost lives that earlier approval could have saved. But what about crops that have actually been engineered to be toxic on purpose? Bt crops are the classic example. These plants carry a gene borrowed from a naturally occurring soil bacterium, Bacillus thuringiensis, which lets the plant produce a protein that destroys the digestive lining of a specific group of insect pests. The plant essentially manufactures its own targeted pesticide, and insects that try to eat it die. On its face, that sounds alarming. Pesticide sprayed onto a plant's surface can at least be washed off, while a toxin the plant builds into its own tissue obviously can't be. In practice, though, it's a much smaller deal than it first sounds, because poison is almost entirely a matter of perspective and biology. Something harmless to one species can be lethal to another. Coffee, for instance, is technically a natural insecticide, deadly to a wide range of insects while being perfectly fine, even enjoyable for humans. Chocolate works the same way in reverse, a genuine hazard for dogs, a treat for us. Bt's toxin is built specifically around the internal digestive architecture of certain insects, and it simply has no equivalent target to interact with inside the human body, making it functionally harmless to us. There's also the opposite engineering strategy, crops modified to tolerate specific herbicides. That lets farmers spray broadly to kill competing weeds without harming the crop itself. And this is genuinely where the more legitimate concerns about GMOs start to show up. For the agrochemical industry, herbicide-tolerant crops are enormous business. Well over 90% of major cash crops grown in the United States today are herbicide-resistant, most commonly engineered to tolerate glyphosate, and as a direct result, glyphosate use has climbed substantially. That's not automatically bad news on its own. Glyphosate is measurably less toxic to humans than many of the herbicides it replaced. But it does mean farmers now have a strong financial incentive to lean almost entirely on one single chemical tool, pushing more balanced, diversified weed management strategies to the side. And that points to one of the deepest, most persistent problems in the entire GMO debate. A lot of what gets framed as criticism of the underlying technology is really criticism of modern industrial agriculture and of the small number of large corporations that control much of the global food supply. That criticism is legitimate and genuinely important. Agriculture badly needs to move toward more sustainable practices. But GMOs, as a technology in their own right, are much better understood as a potential ally in that fight, rather than the enemy, with real, demonstrated potential to help protect the natural world rather than damage it further. Part of what keeps the fear alive, separate from any of the actual evidence, is something psychologists sometimes call the naturalistic fallacy. the intuitive but not actually reliable assumption that anything natural must be safer or better than anything artificial or man-made. It's an understandable instinct, but a genuinely poor guide to safety on its own. Arsenic and nightshade are entirely natural, insulin produced by genetically modified bacteria is not. And none of that tells you anything reliable about which is actually more dangerous to consume. Mandatory labeling laws for GM ingredients exist in dozens of countries now, largely in response to public demand for the right to know and choose, even though the underlying scientific consensus is that the ingredient itself isn't riskier. A genuine tension between respecting consumer choice and worrying that a label reading contains GMOs quietly implies a safety risk the evidence doesn't actually support. A couple of concrete examples make that case well. Eggplant is a major crop in Bangladesh, but pest infestations used to regularly wipe out entire harvests, forcing farmers to lean heavily on chemical pesticides, an expensive habit that also made many of them sick from repeated exposure. A genetically modified eggplant variety introduced in 2013, carrying that same targeted Bt protein, changed the equation almost immediately. Insecticide use on the crop dropped by more than 80%, and farmers' health and income both improved noticeably as a result. Sometimes genetic engineering isn't just the better option, it's the only realistic one. In the 1990s, Hawaii's entire papaya industry came under existential threat from the ring spot virus, which was rapidly wiping out orchards across the islands. The solution that ultimately saved the industry was a papaya variety genetically engineered to resist the virus directly, essentially vaccinated against it at the genetic level. Without that intervention, Hawaii's commercial papaya industry would very likely have collapsed entirely. Stories like these, though, only really showcase a fairly narrow slice of what this technology is actually capable of. Right now, roughly 99% of all commercially grown GMOs exist purely to either produce their own pesticide or tolerate an herbicide, which means there's an enormous amount of unrealized potential still sitting on the table. Researchers are already working on GMOs designed to directly improve nutrition. Crops engineered to carry more or different nutrients, like fruit with elevated antioxidant levels, or rice fortified with additional vitamins for populations that rely on it as a dietary staple. On a larger scale, scientists are also working to engineer crops that can withstand a changing climate, plants better able to tolerate erratic weather and difficult soil conditions, holding up against both drought and flooding. Some approaches borrow genes from naturally extreme-tolerant organisms entirely outside agriculture, genes from desert-adapted mosses that can survive months without water, or from salt-tolerant wild grasses that grow in soil too briny for ordinary crops, and transplant that resilience into staple food crops that would never have evolved it on their own, on any realistic timescale. GMOs could go even further than just reducing agriculture's environmental footprint. They could actively help repair it. Some researchers are working on crops that can pull nitrogen directly from the air the way certain microbes already do. Nitrogen is a critical fertilizer, but its runoff and buildup pollutes waterways and accelerates climate change. A crop that fixes its own nitrogen could simultaneously ease fertilizer overuse in wealthy countries and fertilizer scarcity in poorer ones. Researchers have even explored engineering plants into dramatically more efficient carbon absorbers, inspired by naturally exceptional carbon-capturing species, like the American chestnut, as a genuine tool for slowing or even reversing climate change. With the genetic tools available today, the real limiting factor increasingly seems to be imagination rather than raw capability. The scale of the underlying problem is enormous. Humanity already consumes something like 11 million pounds of food every single day, and UN estimates suggest global food demand could rise by roughly 70% by 2050, driven by both population growth and rising incomes in parts of the world that are eating more resource-intensive diets than they used to. There are really only two broad ways to meet that kind of demand. Keep clearing more forest for new farmland and leaning more heavily on chemical inputs, or find ways to grow significantly more food on the land already in use through more effective tools like genetically modified crops. Intensifying existing farmland instead of continuously expanding it is exactly the kind of shift that could eventually let GMO become as unremarkable and mainstream a label as organic is today. None of this means genetic engineering is some kind of magic wand that fixes agriculture on its own, or that every specific application of it deserves a free pass from scrutiny. Plenty of individual products, patents, and business practices built around GM crops absolutely deserve continued, careful examination, the same way any powerful technology does. But treating the underlying science itself as inherently dangerous, rather than judging each specific application on its actual evidence, risks throwing away one of the more genuinely promising tools available for feeding a growing population without destroying the ecosystems that population ultimately depends on. Taken together, genetic engineering has the potential not just to reshape agriculture, but to meaningfully soften some of the environmental damage humanity has already caused. Used thoughtfully, with continued honest scrutiny rather than blind trust or blind rejection, GMOs could end up being one of the more powerful tools available for protecting the biosphere we all depend on. Not because the technology is flawless, but because the alternative, doing nothing and hoping conventional methods alone can keep pace with a growing and warming world, looks considerably riskier by comparison.